Hello and welcome to Building Community Infrastructure, the foundation stone of economic regeneration, a transatlantic virtual discussion, a special Heartlands Transformation Network event hosted by the Jefferson Educational Society. I'm Ben Speg, and I'm the Vice President of the JES, a nonpartisan think tank headquartered in Erie, Pennsylvania, in the United States of America, offering world-class programming, publications, and plenty more worldwide, and a proud partner of the Heartlands Transformation Network, led and facilitated by Eisenhower Institute Senior Fellow John Austin. The Heartlands Transformation Network is a transatlantic collaborative partnership dedicated toward closing geographic economic divides and reconnecting residents of rural and former industrial heartlands communities to economic opportunity. Network members representing and working with think tanks, universities, and other non-governmental organizations and more work to return community pride and optimism about the future and diminish the appeal of polarizing, resentment-driven, isolationist, and ethno-nationalist political movements that threaten our democracies. Here, we are gathered to talk about building community infrastructure, the importance of leadership, social capital, and capacity building, reknitting social networks, effective citizen engagement, and community empowerment, and restoring pride in place, and why these so-called soft infrastructures are critical elements of community regeneration. For context, insight, and best practices, we'll turn to a panel of experts for a discussion moderated by Olivia Brockman, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a visiting research fellow at University College London, and is the principal in LB Strategy Advisory LLC. She specializes in revitalization policy and practices, focusing on post-industrial cities and regions to improve the lives of the people living in these places. Olivia also currently serves on the United States Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland's Community Advisory Council. Now, before I turn things over to her, I want to go through some housekeeping. We are hosting this event both via Zoom webinar and are live streaming on the JES's Facebook page. If you're attending via Zoom, please feel free to interact with us using the Q&A function, as we'll welcome questions from you, the viewers. If you're tuning in via Facebook, leave your questions and comments in the comments section of this post. We're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can following a discussion with our panelists. If you're listening to or watching this program, streaming it on demand at a later date, still send us those questions, comments to keep this conversation going, either on the JES's Facebook page or our YouTube channel. And for more information about the Heartlands Transformation Network, as well as upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs, publications, and more, visit our website at jeserie.org and be sure to connect with us on the social platform of your choice. Now to introduce the panel and begin our conversation on building community infrastructure, the foundation stone of economic regeneration, a transatlantic virtual discussion. Let us welcome Olivia Brockman.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben, and welcome to everybody. I'm Olivia Brockman, and actually a practitioner by background and training. I'm thrilled to be moderating this timely discussion about the importance of building community infrastructure. Briefly, as a proud resident of the American Midwest, where I grew up, after being away for close to 2 decades, I returned to a very different Ohio in the early 2000s. And my work took me to cities and towns, large and small, throughout the state and the Midwest at large. I saw empty industrial sites and some disinvested neighborhoods and towns that brought home to me the depths of these challenges, with generations left out of pathways to future careers, jobs, and quality of life, and with implications for our national destinies. This experience is mirrored, of course, in other parts of Western countries, Western Europe. So we who live in these places knew long before they were featured in national press pieces and in national political conversations that they needed new hope and new tools for redevelopment. So we have a window right now for transformation. There's been a passage of unprecedented national place-based policies that target many left behind places in both the US and the UK. But where are all these policies leaving our communities, and what will really boost and renew them, mend social fabric, and bolster identity? And what local capacities are needed to maximize the impact of these policies to sustain over the longer term? So this conversation, we're going to turn and delve into the importance and challenges of empowering local communities and building local infrastructure to enable them to navigate these transitions from formerly industrial economies to advanced manufacturing and other future forward-looking economic growth. We've got four great panelists today to lead the discussion. Dr. Furki Faradi has been with the Jefferson Educational Society since its founding in 2008 and rose quickly to the position of the organization's president. During his tenure with JES, Dr. Faradi has supervised more than 1,500 programs, including the national recognized annual Global Summit Speaker Series. He holds a doctorate from the University of Pittsburgh School of Education and lives in the city of Erie, PA, with his family, where he is civically active. John Tamani, professor of urban and regional planning at University College London, is author and architect of community social infrastructure building efforts in numerous UK communities. His research has been principally concerned with the development of cities and regions as socioeconomic, political, and cultural phenomena. His work focuses especially on questions of governance, frequently aimed at live policy debates. His recent book, Social Infrastructure and Left Behind Places, sheds a new light on the importance of understanding the unique challenges of left behind places and the need for community-driven solutions. Turning to Kat Manchester, a Gettysburg College student with the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College Heartlands Project with a deep interest in these issues. Kat is participating in an experiential learning program as part of the Transforming Industrial Heartlands Initiative and has traveled to the Pittsburgh region and interviewed community residents about their experience and perspective and shared findings at a featured meeting at University of Michigan that focused on rebuilding pride, ownership, and a more robust future. Last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Sebastian Kurtenbach, professor at Munster University of Applied Sciences and also a lecturer at the Ruhr University in Bochum, Germany. His work focuses on community conditions conducive to individuals becoming radicalized, but his recent work has zeroed in on the role of social infrastructure, where the neighborhood effect on vulnerability, how it can be mitigated by the density and diversity of social service organizations. So thank you to you all. Really looking forward to the discussion. Let's start with Furki. Furki, you and JES have been pioneering new forms of local citizen and civic engagement to drive community progress for the Erie, Pennsylvania region. You also engage more broadly with learning with issues of the day and around the world. How would you define and describe the unique JES model and approach and what makes it effective? I know you recently presented to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development meeting about community infrastructure that took place in Paris. How would you highlight that work and how it's making a difference locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally?
Well, thanks for having me. And first of all, I want to thank John Austin for his amazing work that he's doing in bringing our worlds together. I would never be able to meet any of you wonderful, wonderful people had it not been for John's work. So thank you, John. The Jefferson Society is, we're going in our 17th year here in Erie, Pennsylvania. And it came about because right around 2006, 2007, there was a study that was done by some local scholars that found out that an idea that would emerge in some of the bigger cities, the cities that were doing better than us, were taking about 8 to 12 years to emerge here in Erie, Pennsylvania. So about 13 to 15 people came together, put a bunch of money, about $3 million to start the Jefferson Educational Society, which was meant to be a platform to expedite the emergence of ideas, to expedite the discussions that needed to happen here locally, and to help bring best practices to Erie, Pennsylvania. So we started that with basically two models. We modeled ourselves after the old Chautauqua movement, which was a huge thing. I did a whole dissertation on this, by the way, in the late 19th, early 20th century, where it started from one chapter here in Western New York. And within a decade, there were 800 Chautauquas across the country providing civic education, citizenship education to to small communities, to civic deserts, is what we refer to them today. They targeted cities with that had population of under 30,000 back then. You didn't need a Chautauqua in the bigger cities, the founders argued. So programmatically, we modeled ourselves after Chautauqua. At its height, there were 800 Chautauquas, 50 million people were taking Chautauqua programming. Teddy Roosevelt called it the most American thing in America. And then the Great Depression comes about, and a lot of these Chautauquas ceased to exist. A movement that gave, that helped um, the 19th Amendment go through, which is women's right to vote. It helped the progressive era in the United States on things like child labor laws and so on and so forth, ceased to exist in places like Erie, Pennsylvania. And it was time for us to restart that programmatically. Then we looked at what Brookings does with its publications, and we decided that we also wanted a publication division here in Pennsylvania, in Erie, Pennsylvania, with a local focus to bring scholars in that continuously do work. So we have a scholar in residence program. And now we're producing about 300 to 350 publications a year that come out of the Jefferson. Programmatically, we do about 150 lectures. We're in 5 chapters here in Erie County. We're in 3 in the rural area. There's our main, which is in Midtown Erie, Pennsylvania, and then we have a lower east side, which is the minority, where the minority population lives heavily, to produce programming that they're interested in. So we do about 150 programs a year. We have a global summit in the fall, which we're in the middle of right now. We had Liz Cheney actually last week, and we hosted the biggest educational event in Erie's history, where almost 4,000 people showed up to it. So it's been vastly successful. We also have a leadership academy that we created sort of as an intergenerational learning platform, where we graduate about 30 people every year. It's a 7-month program, and it is meant to diversify our leadership pool, because every study that was done in Erie was basically saying you got to do something with your leadership. There's not a lot of people that are interested in providing civic leadership in the community, and so on and so forth. And it's been vastly successful. As a result of the Jefferson, we have had about $1.5 billion already invested in our community. We've played a role in some of the biggest projects that have come through, that are ongoing in this community, and we have played a major role in the renaissance of Erie, Pennsylvania, something that we're trying to keep going as we move forward.
Excellent, Berkey. And we want to come back to the building of leadership theme, I think, the local leadership, really, really important. So thank you for that. John, want to go to you now. While you are a professor at UCL, you are from and live mostly in Newcastle in Northern England. You have an extensive body of work on left behind places and recently published the work I mentioned earlier. From where you sit, how would you define social infrastructure, and why is it critical to the social and economic well-being right now of these communities?
I would define social infrastructure as the tissue, the connective tissue, which brings communities together. Cohesive communities are usually richly endowed with social infrastructure. What that means is, in practice, spaces, physical spaces where communities can gather, but also the networks and relationships that are engendered in those spaces. And we came to this issue, as you correctly point out, through our interest in left behind places, particularly in the UK, but I think this is a problem across the global north. The places, as The Economist described them in 2017, that have been left behind by globalization. So these are places which were often prosperous, had strong industrial bases, but have lost them, and have been trapped in a cycle of little or low levels of development. And what we see in the UK is a growing divide between places, but also divides emerging within places as people move out for other opportunities. Some people move into places because they're cheap, low-cost places to live. So, how do you create coherent communities in this kind of context? How do you overcome division and rebuild the sorts of cohesion which these communities traditionally had? And in our we've looked particularly at mining communities in England, and these are often very small communities, villages. They're, in many ways they look like rural settlements, but they were industrial communities. And once their coal mine has closed, they're really left high and dry economically and socially. But these were places which were often rich in this social infrastructure, much of it built by the communities themselves, and that has run down over time. And what we see as, that contributes in a very significant way to dereliction in these communities, because often the largest buildings were the miners' halls or the cooperative societies, which traditionally provide services in those places. So we're interested in what happens when that social infrastructure runs down, and what role it played in the past and how you might rebuild that in the future. And I've been very influenced in all of this by some US literature, particularly Eric Klinenberg's book, Palaces for People, which looks at this issue in a US context. But I suppose more broadly, the work of writers like Robert Putnam, who seek to understand, what produces cohesive, well-functioning civic order in places. So for me, social infrastructure is important in producing cohesive communities. And once it disappears, it becomes both a symbol and at times a cause of a kind of demoralization of communities. So we're interested in that process, but we're also interested in identifying the people in these communities who are trying to do something about the problems, often reclaiming old buildings, repurposing them. This is a tremendous struggle because they're doing it in very poor communities where there aren't many resources. And our message to policymakers in the UK, and I would say elsewhere, is this is an area you neglect at your peril, because it's at the heart of what makes well-functioning communities.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, John. And now I want to go to sort of the on-the-ground perspective back in the US. Kat, welcome to the conversation. As part of the experiential learning program, you interviewed community residents in Pittsburgh, in the Pittsburgh region, about their experience and their perspective. Talk a little bit about what you learned about the worldview of residents in more hollowed out places and their role in forging community regeneration and renewal.
Absolutely. I'm honored and excited to be here with all of you. This is very exciting to me to be surrounded by so many knowledgeable people. And of course, I want to thank John Austin for really his focus on getting young people involved in this. But as part of my experiential learning program, my small team of 4 people, we were looking at these areas surrounding Pittsburgh that were formerly industrialized. And we did a lot of research leading up to our trip to these communities, economic, political, looking at population changes. And at the start of our trip, we really went in thinking we had a full picture of what was going on in these communities. And then once we were on the ground talking to change makers, leaders in the community, lifelong residents, we were very wrong, which was interesting. I think the overall theme of the people that we talked to was that they truly do feel left behind. They love their communities, they are involved in their communities, and they're striving to make as much change and betterment for their communities as they possibly can. But by larger society, they just feel left behind. And the changes that are taking place what was communicated to us was that it's not the changes that were necessary or relevant to the places that they were in. The building of infrastructure, inviting of new businesses that required different education levels did more harm than it did good to these communities. And it really kind of created a sense of disappointment within these communities to the point where they didn't feel that they could move forward with outside help, that they were going to have to fix it themselves. But I think the largest kind of worldview and takeaway, especially that I took, just speaking to these residents, was that they were unwilling to die. They were unwilling to let their towns be swallowed by a new industry, taken over, left behind. They really had an attitude of, if something's going to change, we're going to have to do it ourselves. And if we're going to do whatever it takes to ensure that our town and the community that we love survives. And that's really the efforts that we saw going into these communities and going on the ground and hearing from these people were just how connected they were with their communities and how hard they were working to make change because they couldn't rely on others to come in and help them with that.
Well, that's very heartening to hear, Kat, and definitely want to come back to that, delve a little more deeply into that. Now to Sebastian to offer some perspectives from Germany. Sebastian, you have focused a lot on whether social infrastructure has had an impact on coexistence and on difficult conditions. I'm wondering what kinds of social infrastructure you are seeing emerge in the communities where you're focusing your research, whether that's the Ruhr or other areas of Germany. And how are you seeing where it can mitigate some of these social ills and encourage hope and regrowth?
Okay. Thank you so much. And also thank you for the invitation and also to John Austin for the invitation and to reach out for me. It's an honor to be here. To give you an answer, I have to give you a bit basic information, background information about how the social infrastructure is organized in Germany, because I think it's quite different than in the US, because it really depends on public money, usually on money from the municipalities. And the what we see in the last years, that also because of the fragmentation and increasing complexity of the German society, also local social infrastructure became much more complicated. We can see that when, for example, when we look on consulting services. Consulting services a couple of years ago were offered services, for example, for unemployment people to get their papers properly for to submit for job offers, right? And these kinds of services became very special the last years. For example, now we have those services for European citizens, or not, and or for asylum seekers, or for asylum seekers from Ukraine, or for single mothers, and so on. Because we do have a kind of competition in the market of local social services, they become very specialized. And this leads to the issue that you have consulting services, for example, in one neighborhood, but they're not open for all, just for specific groups. It can work if they're connected to each other. One thing what Mario Louis Small raised up a couple of years ago, and here on the practical side, we see a lot of work to do. When we prospect what will happen in the next years because of the budget crisis of the German federal state, but also of the municipalities, we can expect that this level of specialization will decrease, I think, in the next years again.
Thank you, Sebastian. I want to return to a theme that I think is starting to sort of crop up from all of the participants here, and that is, and I heard from Kat and John both mention the richness of local networks in these places and of sort of community fabric. And I wanted to go back, John, to you. to talk a little bit more about how to build on that and what it means to really rebuild community infrastructure around that previous richness to benefit the people and communities that live in these places. And related, we do have an opportunity, as I mentioned at the top, to perhaps it's a window of opportunity with our governments focused, have some focused policies on places. How do we leverage that at the same time?
Sorry, just unmuting myself. The so yes, I mean just I'd say that Kat's account of what she discovered in her work resonates very strongly with what we've found in our work. The communities that we've worked in have been the target of all kinds of what you might call top-down interventions aimed at regenerating them in some form or other. But typically, these top-down efforts have really failed to hit the target or shift the dial in terms of the social and economic indicators. And what this produces is a very high level of cynicism about government intervention. Nobody believes it when the government says, it's that Ronald Reagan phrase, the most terrifying words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That, in a sense, that is true. People do feel like that, whether it's the national government or the local government. And this feeds a high level of political disengagement. So we find that in our communities, there are lots of people working at the local scale who are not really connected to the political process. They're very cynical about it, but they want to do something in their community. So they're coming together and trying to find ways to do this. So a story I'll tell you, which I think is a very powerful one, in one of the former coal mining villages that we've been working in, a collection of community organizations took over an old co-op store in the center of the village, which had been empty for a long time, almost a kind of symbol of the decline of the village. And they've brought it back into use. And they've done that by using it to provide a set of services, if you like, for the village. So there's a wood social enterprise that does woodworking, but also trains young kids who are struggling in the school system for one reason or another, trying very often, mainly to keep them out of the criminal justice system. A youth project that provides a range of activities out of school childcare for families which couldn't otherwise afford them, and so on. And so they've taken over this building and they're undertaking these activities in there. They've raised money to refurbish the building, and they're very adept at finding resource to keep their activities going. But it's always a struggle. Um, they lurch from one project to another, and one of the partly funded by government agencies of one kind or other, partly funded by private philanthropy, partly funded by their own commercial activities or charges that they introduce, they levy for the services they provide. But it's a very hand-to-mouth existence. And my view would be that in the UK context, and I think this is true in other places that we've looked at, because we've done a bit of work in France and Germany on this as well, what's required is a much more stable financial framework within which these organizations can operate. Because the distinctive feature of these organizations, without romanticizing them or in any way, is that they do understand their communities. They understand their needs in a way that external policymakers, government officials, even philanthropists simply don't understand. And they can identify what needs to be done. Even down in a very fine-grained way, which street needs an intervention, which household are the kids going off the rails, and I think that's where there's great opportunities, but it's very hard, particularly in the UK context, where we have a very highly centralized system of government, very hard to connect that to the priorities of government. And I suppose that one role that we're seeking to play as academics in this process is precisely to fill that gap and say to the policymakers, look, there are opportunities here for you to invest your resource in ways which has a better chance of achieving the outcomes that you want. They don't need a new bit warehouse which will employ a small number of people. They need community facilities which will deal with some of the foundational problems that exist in the village.
Really, I think a great point. And it kind of leads back to a question, Furky, I wanted to go back to you about. You mentioned building civic leadership as something that Jefferson has been focused on. And certainly a lot of what John and Kat have pointed to, sort of how to fix it themselves, as it were, requires a certain amount of leadership in building that. How do you see that occurring in Erie through JES? Good efforts.
All right, so I'm going to take off my scholarly hat and just speak plainly as I can.
Please.
One of the things that I tell everybody, no one is coming to solve your problems. That you are going to have to take your problems on head on, and building social capital. And I am totally with Kat that there are social networks in these small communities, but the world is really small. So our job is to provide knowledge to adults, to our politicians, to our public servants, to bring ideas to the community. Also to find young people that are interested in having a civic role, but they don't know where to start. So what we do is we started this about 8 years ago. We have about nearly 300 graduates. But what we do is very simple. We get about 30 people. We send them to Harrisburg. First of all, not a lot of young people know how important the state government here in the United States is to our day-to-day life. And most of our young people have never been to Harrisburg. So we take them to Harrisburg. They meet with the governor. They meet with the state legislator. They get their citizenship learning out of the way so that they know what governments are doing what. Then they come back here. And Pennsylvania is a Quaker town. We have, I think, the most amount of municipalities of any state in the United States. So what we do is we spend 7 months going from municipality to municipality, trying to get these young people to understand the different forms of government here locally and what each government does and what are the wicked problems that each government, and there's like this intergenerational sharing of ideas. A lot of these public servants or politicians, as we call them sometimes, they don't mean to do bad things. Sometimes they just need to learn from the new generation that's coming up, and vice versa. The young folks learn from what problems they're working on, and what we've seen over the last 10 years, these 300 people, nearly 300 people, are emerging. Some of them are serving on boards. Other ones are running for public office. And there's sort of a network, a connector network that has been built here out of the Jefferson Society of folks that are more informed on what's happening around the world and what's working and what's not working. In the meantime, they work in a project together. All 30 of them have to produce a publishable project. I think this year's project is on, sorry, I'm forgetting this year's project, but they worked on things like blight. They worked on things like the blue economy and how do we use water. And they're forced to do deep research altogether and learn how to work as part of a group for ideas to come to consensus. So.
Thank you, Perky. That civic education, I think, is really critical these days. I see some questions coming in, which is fantastic. I want to go to them in a minute. I want to just briefly go back to Sebastian and Kat one more time, and then we'll go to audience questions. Sebastian, I'm wondering to this point of sort of government coming in to solve solutions and maybe precipitate some important community rebuilding, but where is that trade-off, and where does it get spurred on by some government policy, but we've also heard from Kat the importance of communities feeling like they want to fix it themselves. They want to be empowered or empower themselves to address these problems. How are you seeing that
Mhm.
manifest in your work? And what are the
Okay.
implications?
Maybe I will answer the question from different points because I'm not only an academic, but I was also trained as a social worker and I worked as a social
Excellent.
worker and as a community organizer. And we had in a former coal mining neighborhood in the rural area Dienstlaken-Lohberg. And this is a crucial question because especially places which feel left behind want to feel that they have the power to change their own route, right? And but they don't have the resources. So it's always a negotiation between the empowerment of a community on the one hand and to provide resources which are related to law restrictions and so on how to spend money. And what I think what is helpful is, but here now comes the community organizer, not the professor for social policy, is to help the folks to organize themselves. And therefore, they need social infrastructure or call it third places. But they have to have these third places in their own hands. And this is what is declining. I think it's declining not only in Germany, but all over Europe, and I think also in the US, that these important places are declining and that the local communities lose these crucial infrastructure. And we can see that in Germany when we compare East and West Germany with each other. Especially in the rural parts and former industrial parts of Eastern Germany, they're all gone since a decade. And especially in these places, populist movements are now getting most votes in elections. Also, young people left these places, and we can see that these communities are less organized than in other parts of Germany. So we need local social service organizations, but we need also these third places which provide a kind of a platform and a trust in society to organize themselves. And this is a balance we need to seek.
Yeah. And Pat, uh, you are exhibit A of a young person who is involved and getting more involved, and noted Furky's lifting up of the need to engage more young folks through the civic education that they're doing. Um, Talk a little bit more about when you were doing your interviews, how you saw people connecting, um, staying connected with their places, and what's the power of that to making change?
Wonderful question. I think that there is a big lack of, honestly, just also youth awareness of this issue. Coming into the program that I did, I knew somewhat what heartlands were and transformative placemaking. But since then, I've become much more knowledgeable. But I'll talk to my friends about it or people on my college campus. And unless they came from a place that was formerly industrialized or has been left behind, they're very unaware of these issues. Going into these communities and talking to people, one of the biggest issues that was expressed to us was the fact that so many youth from these communities are leaving because they don't see any opportunity in the places that they are. And when there is new infrastructure or new markets coming in, they don't have the educational resources or educational levels to jump into that job market. So they're essentially, there is nothing left for them in the communities in which they grew up in. And so it's kind of left to the people that have stayed there forever. And so it was a big issue that we talked about going around to these different communities and how do we address this and how do we solve this? And it really came down to those kind of core community structures that were necessary in order to ensure that the youth are involved in building back this community. So things like education and access to education. Like we looked at a town very near Pittsburgh called Braddock, that actually retained an old steel mill, so it's still in function, and those children leave their community to go to school. And so everything that they do in change making, all their clubs and activities, the communities that they're getting involved with, especially in the forms of education, are left to Pittsburgh. They're not back in the communities that they call home. So it's kind of those sort of infrastructures and like social structures that kind of build up youth and make them into change makers and give them social capital and teach them how to activate that capital that is lacking within these towns. And the support for those structures are just not there.
Thank you, Kat. So I'm going to go to a couple of questions from our audience, which I think build really well on this conversation. And I guess I'll go back to John and then have the rest of the group answer as well. I think there's a pressing need to look at how we connect sort of more focus on emotional literacy, as one audience member mentioned, mutual problem solving, and sort of a term that he introduced called solidarity of care. So on the social health and social services side, how do we connect those better to sort of to the economic growth organizations? In the US, at least, they are very different. They occupy very different spaces. And I wonder, how do we think about connecting the dots between that sort of community health, whether it's mental health, emotional health, physical health, with these economic drivers, which are often the policy that's coming down from above? I think there's a real disconnect there, both in the policy but in the practice. Actually, Furky, why don't we go to you? I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so that's been sort of the issues here in Erie over the years. Is most of the money was being put into economic development, and not a lot of money was being put or thought was being put in the social aspect of being an Erieite. And Kat is absolutely right that people feel disconnected from their community. In fact, this year, our project for the Leadership Academy is mental health in Erie County. It is a thing that the Jefferson is trying to bring in best practices for, right? We're really in a business of not creating knowledge, but finding the knowledge that when somebody has figured something out, we want to bring that person to Erie and tell their story, right? So we had last year, we had a person from the Brookings who wrote a book. I think his last name is Reeves, on of boys and men, right?
Richard Reeves.
And what's happening with the male population in America, that we are not paying enough attention to the fact that we're a top 10 place on Earth that has the highest suicide rate amongst men, right, here in the United States. And what's happening with that? So, our Leadership Academy, for example, is made of the business world, is made of the social service world, and they're coming together on all these different paradigms that are bringing together in the Leadership Academy to look at this very wicked problem and what are the potential solutions, whether that's with mental health. A few years back, we studied the opioid epidemic and what are some of the solutions around helping folks with that, because it was the #1 killer in our county a few years back. So, and then how do we use that knowledge to inform the stakeholders? That is our job, is after they produce the report, after they produce the presentation, we want to make sure that the right people that are making decisions on these issues are at the table. Because, as I said earlier, sometimes they just don't know what to do. But somebody else, the world is a big place. We are not going to be able to figure out all of our problems with the knowledge of a county of 260,000. There's 7 billion people in the world. Our job is to find the solutions. They don't have to come from within. We have to go and find them. So that's my thought on that.
Thank you very much. John, go to you on that.
I think this is a very topical question that you posed earlier, Olivia, in the UK context, because we have a National Health Service, which is a state provider of healthcare, which is in big difficulties in lots of ways at the moment. And we have a new government which has talked about the need for 3 shifts in the way we provide care. And that partly comes about because we have rising problem of economic non-participation in the UK, people unable to work because of illness of one kind or another. And this is not spread evenly throughout the economy. It's highly concentrated in certain places. And these are both psychological and physiological problems that people are suffering with. So how do you deal with that? Well, the new government's talked about the need for 3 shifts, because the National Health Service is concerned essentially with running hospitals. But many of the health problems that we need to tackle are actually located in communities, and hospitals are not the answer to the problems in those communities. So the 3 shifts that the government talks about is the shift from an approach based on hospitals to an approach based on communities, an approach based on treating sickness to preventing sickness, and a shift from an analog to a digital form of service provision. And this all points to the importance of the community, and the community level and the small scale is the place where lots of these problems can be addressed. So, for instance, picking up on Fergie's point just a moment ago, the region that we're working in at the moment, where I'm based at the moment, has a male suicide rate twice that of London. Now, that's a public health crisis in plain sight, which barely anybody talks about, actually. Certainly, publicly, it's not talked about, although there are some fantastic community-level responses to this, and particularly at men and boys, because that's where the problem is concentrated. And suicide is really a sort of an example of what Angus Dayton, again, drawing on US evidence, has called deaths of despair. Right? Communities where people are so despairing of their prospects that they just die for one reason or another at an early age. So this is an area where I think action is really needed. And Reeves's book, which Fergie mentioned, I think is a very powerful intervention in all of this. Action is really needed in this space, but the conventional tools don't work. The levers that we're pulling are having no effect. And the answer to these problems lies in the community. So I can point you to a fantastic initiative set up by a young veteran from the Royal Air Force, who came out of the Royal Air Force in this despairing condition, pulled his whole life around by creating an organization which deals with the problems of young men in particular who get lost in this downward spiral. And he does wonderful work, but it's a struggle because the system doesn't really he's up against a system which is not really interested in the way he's working. But there are answers there, and there are people seeking them, and we need to do much more in this space.
And John, I really appreciate your pointing out framing the conventional tools are really not working. And I think that is an underlying theme here. Sebastian, how would you weigh in on this sort of disconnect between the health issues and community empowerment and sort of economic prosperity growth drivers?
It's a very crucial topic in Germany, you should know at the moment, because we are an aging society, a fast aging society, and one topic in this debate of the aging society is loneliness. Loneliness is a very important issue on the local level. It causes mental health problems, and one strategy to overcome this raising health problem on the local level is try to strengthen neighborhood relations, to take or to form communities that care, but therefore we, as John highlighted, the ways we work on the local level until now don't work to address that issue. And I would say maybe it's not a wonder to drop that on this panel, but we need a social infrastructure on the neighborhood level, which strengthens the community in general, and to strengthen the trust among people, the collective efficacy with the neighborhoods, and that they are able to respond not always to crises from outside of the neighborhood, but also to take care about also vulnerable groups within their neighborhood. But this is a completely different approach to address health issues through a way which is not rooted in medicine or not rooted in the medical system. But the outcome is more important than the original actor. And this is, I think, a new way and an interconnection between social infrastructure on the one hand and health issues on the other hand.
Great point. I want to bring in a question from the audience that I think may tie some of this together. Someone has asked about the role of public engagement, public meetings, town halls, in kind of reinventing social infrastructure and building community, and maybe also a role in airing some of these issues that maybe are not talked about as frequently because we don't want to acknowledge them or they're very painful. So I wonder, and Fergie, I'll start with you briefly. We're getting low on time, but I know that JES has involved in some very much in public engagement, but where are you seeing that sort of helping bolster new ideas for approaching this?
Yeah. So I write about this in my dissertation. We're in what's called adult education, right? So you have adult education is human development, which is skill building, and then there's social capital building, right? There's informal education, which is like parades and museums and so on and so forth, or formal education where you're getting degrees. We're in the non-formal education piece, right? That is where we fit in. So, we don't want to duplicate things like public forums and all that stuff. There's plenty of that happening in our community, at least. You've got city council, county council, all the authorities, they all have places where you can air out your grievances, right? The school district. We're a little different. Here's a discussion, and it's important that the community comes together. This really shoulder to shoulder learning and the power of applause of learning. That is our thing. When people see that an idea that is presented here in Erie, Pennsylvania, let's say downtown development, when you have another 300 people in the room for you that are just saying, yeah, that's a wonderful idea, then there's like huge issue that was in Erie where people felt like they could do nothing to help solve their problems. Sorry, my internet is going down, it says. I'm gonna stop talking.
I think we heard all your good offerings there. So in the last 5 minutes remaining, I want to sort of do a flash question that shouldn't be of surprise to anybody, but U.S. presidential election is imminent. If you could each offer one piece of advice to our national leaders, to our candidates on building and rebuilding social infrastructure from the ground up, that can really have an impact on people's lives, what would you say? Um, let's see. Kat, I'll start with you if you don't mind.
Big question. Big event coming up. Very excited
Big
to be
event.
my first
Yes.
presidential voting. Very excited.
Love it. Love it.
I would honestly probably say, listening to all these perspectives, and it might be idealistic, but just kind of a grand overview. Don't do what's easy, do what's right. It's so easy to take a top-down approach and put upon these regions what you think is the best change that's needed in the infrastructure and throw the money. But what is right to do is to listen to the people, listen to these communities, get involved, go see it on the ground, or have a meeting. I mean, I can't imagine how impactful this webinar would be to also include community leaders into the conversation. So doing not what is easy, but what is right, I think is the most important step when we continue to consider these left behind towns.
Can we put you in the White House, Kat?
Not sure I'm ready for that yet. I'll get a degree
Okay.
first and then maybe.
Sebastian.
It's quite easy to give good advices to the US when you're located in Europe, right? Um, I think what I would say to all political leaders in democratic societies is trust your people, and give them the space to organize themselves. And everything else is not in your hand because it's a democracy, and you have to cope with the outcome of what people do. And this is what I would say: trust your people.
John, from across the pond.
Well, actually, the British Labour Party has been accused by Donald Trump of interfering in your election, I read in the newspaper today. So I should be very cautious about what I say, perhaps say as little as possible in that context. But that's quite easy, actually, because I more or less agree with what Sebastian and Kat have both said, and particularly Sebastian's point about how the elites need to trust the people. Uh, I think that's a key point, because fundamentally they don't, whether it's Trump or Harris or Sunak or Starmer in the UK or Scholz in Germany. I don't think our elites really have much faith in people to solve their own problems. But I think historically they've demonstrated that they can do this. And I think there are people in communities who are willing to do this, and we need to find ways of helping them. And I think that's the key challenge for, as Sebastian said, in our kind of democratic societies. That's the key challenge.
Berkey.
Okay, so I think if you go back in history, most populist movements are take place because people feel helpless. All right. Here's one thing that I would suggest to both parties. Study what the role of the government is. You are killing us because we are, like a place like Erie, Pennsylvania, is competing for federal dollars with New York, with Chicago, with Los Angeles. It's like sending a high school team to compete with NBA players. It ain't right. And we're losing businesses, and therefore we can't beat those guys at the top. So we turn around and find the smaller communities that we're beating, right? So it's a whole thing. Change the formula. How are you supposed to put skin in the game when you don't have any skin? We should not be competing with cities 10 times, 20 times the size of what we are. We're going to lose those battles each and every single time. Fix that problem.
That's great. It's not a zero-sum game. Shouldn't be a zero-sum game. Well, we're right at the top of the hour. I want to thank the Jefferson Education Society. I want to thank John Austin, who has been a wonder in pulling this together and getting all the right people and parts in place for this and for his transatlantic Heartland initiative. So, and thank you, Kat, Ferky, Sebastian, John, and Ben as well. Ben, any closing comments?
Olivia, just to thank you for putting this all together and organizing it. This is a huge topic, and you've done a deft job at moderating it and moving us through quickly. No doubt the continuation of a conversation with much more to come, and a million thanks to those who tuned in and watched, to all of the questions that came in, most of which we tried to get to, plenty that we'll address in other ways into the future. And again, just a lot of thanks to the panelists for sharing your insight, your expertise, your knowledge with everybody, and being so willing to have this conversation and to continue it into the future. And to thank again John for organizing all of this and giving this a platform with the Heartlands Transformation Network. Really thanking everybody there. For more information on that initiative and more work that we're doing, head to gaserie.org. You'll find information on the network, today's event, and much more to come. Be sure to connect on any of the social platforms. Find our panelists, follow their work, find our moderator, follow her work. This is all important conversations. So we thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for a great conversation. Take care.